Hello everyone. If you have been around Canadian firearm circles, you have probably heard of a few instances where the piston on Canadian-made AR180 derivatives would break. It's kind of a hit or miss when they would break. Some people says theirs broke after as few as 150 rounds. Some people have had many more through their guns and everything's fine. Either way, after I saw these two videos uploaded within a week of each other, showing the pistons breaking on the new WK-180 Gen 2, I felt compelled to make this analysis. This will be my attempt to identify the probable causes of this phenomenon and suggest some possible solutions. Naturally, this kind of video will come with a few important disclaimers. First, I fully acknowledge that there may be multiple factors involved in the design process for these pistons that are unknown to me. My video is just an educated guess at best. Second, I do not own any of the Canadian-made AR180s. I'd like to own one at some point, but these issues are making me hesitant. My analysis is completely based on information that I found online. And finally, since I'd like to work in the firearms industry in the future, I just thought that this video would be a fun personal exercise. So this analysis is mainly for me, and obviously I don't expect any manufacturer to take this seriously. I'm literally just a kid on YouTube who graduated from uni a few months ago. So with all of that said, let's begin. Alright, so let's go over the piston design for these Canadian 180s. Specifically, we'll be looking at three guns, the WS-MCR and the WK-180C, both Gen 1 and Gen 2. And note that this analysis will be for these three guns only, and maybe some other ones that use their style of gas pistons. There are some newer Canadian-made AR180 variants that have much better gas pistons. What I have here is the user manual for the Gen 1 WK-180C. You have the gas block here. The piston and the piston spring can be inserted from the front of the gas block. This piece then comes in to plug that front opening, and finally the screw holds everything in place. Even though the parts might be a little different between the variants, this is how they generally work. Also, please note that this seems to be an early design for the piston. Every photo or videos that I can find online show this piston design, where this very large diameter section spans from the very tip to this shoulder where the spring rests on. And again, this geometry is used in all three of the Canadian 180s as far as I can tell. Now let's go over what happens to the piston when you fire the gun. I'm using a diagram of a different piston system here, but everything will apply the same way to our guns. Propellant gases enters the gas chamber and pushes on the front of the piston. The rear of the piston then strikes the front of the bolt carrier. The piston is compressed axially, which leads to some buckling effect. Buckling is where a part with a large length-to-width ratio bends under axial compression. Of course, this is normal and unavoidable, and obviously this level of deflection will not be visible on an actual piston. The second thing that happens is that when a piston gun fires, the barrel tends to whip down a little bit. This also causes some bending of the piston, which again is normal and unavoidable. Alright, now we know that when the gun fires, there are at least two mechanisms that causes bending of the piston rod. Let's look at the design of the piston to see how it might respond to such bending. You can see here that from this point on, the diameter of the piston rod is reduced so that the spring can fit around. Now I don't have a piston in my hand to examine, but in this screenshot here, we can kinda see that the fillet radius is very small. Never mind, I just went to TACCOM and here's the piston. The radius is not as small as I thought, but still, it is a point of stress concentration. The smaller the radius, the more adverse this effect will be. Also, what is extra bad about this is the stress concentration is fairly close to the midpoint of the piston length, where the internal stresses caused by buckling would be highest. Furthermore, the piston is just really thin. When I read online that this is a 1/4 inch piston, I thought that this section must be 1/4 inch. There's no way the piston is that small. But no, it is that small. The larger section is 1/4 inch. After looking at other piston designs similar to the AR-18, I've noticed a peculiar detail, which is they all have a front section that is the same diameter as the spring section, kind of like the drawing in the WK-180C manual. Even in a very long piston like that of the SVD, the front section is still very thin. If you look at this comparison between the BRN-180 and the BRN-180S, the longer piston is thinner. Intuitively, you would have thought that the longer piston should be thicker to resist buckling, right? After all, this formula for buckling shows that a larger length to radius ratio will reduce the load capacity. After thinking about it for a while, I believe that if you compare the designs of the classic AR180 and the Canadian AR180s, the classic one with uniform thickness will have uniform deflection. Meanwhile, in this design, if the piston end were to deflect the same amount, since the front section is so rigid, all of the deformation will happen in this thin section where the stress concentration is. So ironically, by making the front section of the piston more durable, the designers might have made the entire piston less durable. Or, the piston is so small that if you make the front section the same diameter as the rear section, since the front section is longer, it's gonna snap under buckling even before the stress concentration fails. If that's the case, then they're kinda stuck between a rock and a hard place here. So yeah, in the end, I think the reason for the high likelihood of piston failure on Canadian-made AR180s is a combination of a few factors. The piston rod is too rigid at the front section, which transfers all the deflection to this thin section, where there is a stress concentration. This stress concentration is also fairly close to the point of maximum stress if the piston buckles under axial loading. And I think the piston failures that we have seen in real life do match my theoretical analysis. For example, the piston in this video broke exactly at the fillet between the small diameter and large diameter sections. Same for this piston. And even though it's unclear in this video, this piston seems to be broken there too. And again in this Reddit post. Additionally, I'd like to mention that this failure mode is possible even when everything is in spec and in alignment. I have read that the gas blocks on these rifles would sometimes loosen because the set screws that keep them in place backed out. When that happens and the piston is misaligned with the gas block and receiver, the problem is compounded even more. Another thing is, it is entirely possible that the failed piston just had a bad heat treat. But I'd say that if the geometrical design was better, it will create a larger margin of error for heat treatment, and thus the failure rate will reduce. Alright, with that analysis done, let's get into what we can do to alleviate this phenomenon. I'd like to present a few possible solutions with increasing complexity. And of course, all of these solutions have some trade-offs. But first, I will speculate that the reason these pistons are designed this way is because the designer was trying to repurpose DI AR-15 components, or at least they were trying to save material because this handguard is very small and have very little space for the piston system. You can also see in this photo how there's so little clearance between the piston rod and the barrel nut. That was probably why they had to reduce the diameter of the piston here, so that they can fit the spring around it. Additionally, the designer was trying to make it possible to remove the piston rod from the front of the gas block so that you don't have to take off the handguard. Which is cool, but the trade-off for that is every diameter on the piston and piston spring must be small enough to go through the gas chamber. Another thing that is perplexing to me is that they are using a carbine-length gas system for an 18.7-inch barrel. This means the gas block must be small enough to fit under the handguard. Everything is just severely restricting the size of the gas system. So with that in mind, my first proposal would allow the barrel, handguard, and gas block to be kept the same. Literally nothing outside of the piston must be changed in this modification, and the piston assembly can still be removed out the front of the gas block. So, the piston rod can be split into two sections here. Also, these radii should be enlarged, but this one can't be larger than what the spring allows. What these modifications do is that instead of one long piston rod that is more susceptible to bending and buckling, we have two shorter sections. The clearance between these sections would also allow them to wiggle around each other a little bit as the barrel whips, instead of bending the actual parts. The stress concentration is further from the midpoint of each section, which would alleviate the effects of buckling. This design was inspired by the SVT-40, which is the grandfather of the AR-18 gas system. There are a few trade-offs for this design though. These diameters are still very small, and stress concentrations are still connected to these small diameter portions. But hopefully, this proposal will be at least an improvement over the current condition. My second proposal requires drastic changes to the gas block and piston, and a minor change to the receiver. The barrel nut, and handguard can still remain the same, but the handguard will have to be removed to access the piston. So first, we have a female piston and a male gas block. The piston head is a separate piece that's sleeved over the op rod like this. The mating surface between these two parts is a section of a circle, which means the piston cup can wiggle around the op rod as if there's a ball joint between them. The entire diameter of the op rod can be as large as the large section of the current piston rod, but because of that, a modified spacer would be needed here to push the piston spring forward of the barrel nut. The spacer is a bit recessed into the receiver. The OD of the spacer fits snugly into the receiver recess, and the ID of the spacer fits snugly around the op rod. But this hole in the receiver is oversized compared to the op rod to facilitate disassembly. To disassemble this piston system, first, the op rod is pulled out of the piston cup. The spacer is pushed forward out of the recess in the receiver. This assembly can then be tilted upwards and out of the gun, and that's why this hole is oversized. Finally, the piston cup is removed from the back. The advantage of this design is pretty clear, being the much thicker op rod. All of these ODs can be smaller than this gas block OD on current guns, so these modified parts will theoretically fit under the same handguard. As you can probably tell, this design is inspired by a lot of guns like the SVT-40, the AR180, the BRN180, and some of the LWRCs. We interrupt this programming to tell you that I just realized this design is 95% similar to the HK-416 piston assembly. You can see here that the HK-416 also has this spacer to push the spring past this huge barrel nut. The only difference is that this spacer is not recessed into the upper receiver. So yeah, my proposal is nothing new. And the design challenge faced by the Canadian-180s is also nothing new, so I wonder why they did not implement this pre-existing solution. Maybe it's patented? Or they just wanted to make the piston removable out the front of the gas block. Either way, it's interesting. Now the third proposal requires substantial change of the handguard and receiver, but you will be able to remove the piston out the front of the handguard. If the receiver and handguard is just made taller, a larger piston can fit in here. And I decided to not model this because I think this is literally what the new Crusader Arms Templar is doing, just a chunkier handguard and piston system. This gun has just been released and there hasn't been many reviews, but I'm excited to see how it would fare. And the marketing material for this gun specifically emphasizes the fact that it has a bigger piston. Now about the gas blocks. As far as I know, it is best practice to pin the gas block on AR-15s. Let's take a look at these models. The left one is DI and the right one is piston driven. When the gas enters the gas chamber, the pressure applied to these surfaces specifically creates a force pushing the gas block forward. And at the same pressure, the force on the piston gas block would be higher due to the larger surface area. So at least theoretically, it is even more important to secure the gas blocks on piston guns. The fact that all of the Canadian-180s use set screws for their gas blocks is suboptimal in my opinion. Finally, since I own two guns with short-stroke pistons, let's examine them to see how they compare with the Canadian-made AR180s. Here we have the Type 97 piston. It's pretty short and stubby, so the effects of buckling would be significantly reduced. Every flange on this piston has nice large fillets, and interestingly, if I remove this spring, you can see this shoulder here. When the piston moves to the rear, this shoulder bottoms out on this block, so what's limiting the motion of the piston is this hard surface. On the Canadian-made 180s, I believe the piston stops when the spring is fully compressed and the coils touch each other. If I had to guess, I'd say that the Type 97's design is better for the spring. Now onto the second gun, being the SKS. This gun has two piston sections. The first one is contained within the gas tube here, and the second spring-loaded section is inside the rear sight tower. This long piston section doesn't have any stress concentration. Well, there is this diameter transition between the piston head and the rod, but the fillet is insanely large. This short section has a tighter radius here, but it is completely contained within this rear sight tower, so it is not affected by barrel whip. Also, the rearward travel of this piston is stopped when this surface contacts this shoulder inside the rear sight tower. And again, the spring doesn't have to take the blunt of the impact. Also, I'd like to point out that sometimes the part is designed with a certain fillet, but when you turn it on the lathe, the radius of the cutter is much smaller, and the machining marks can become stress concentrations. I literally encountered a situation at work just last week where a cracked part is designed to have a fillet, but when you look closely, the cracks follow the lathe marks perfectly. So yeah, in that aspect, the Type 97 piston is better, since it has a smoother surface finish on the fillets, while the SKS is much rougher. The surface finish on the Canadian-made AR180s is really smooth, so they are making the best out of what they have to work with. But again, I believe the piston is just too thin, and the front section offloads all the stress to this thin section. So that's it for this video. Again, this is just a fun little analysis that I performed based on my level of knowledge and experience, and I certainly don't claim to have as much knowledge and experience as real firearms engineers, so take everything I said with a grain of salt. It might turn out that my proposed changes will make the piston snap in the first magazine. If there's any details that I have missed or gotten wrong, I'd certainly love to hear it in the comment section. Thank you for watching, and bye-bye.